Hey, it's Shirley. I want to start off by saying that I've never been part of an admissions committee, and I am by no means an expert. However, I have worked as an English tutor as well as a writing tutor, have helped dozens of students with their personal statements as well as college essays, and have been accepted to medical school myself. In combination with some online research, these experiences have helped me determine some general guidelines for writing a strong personal statement. With each relevant guideline, I'll include examples that can be improved upon, as well as examples that did a fairly good job of following these guidelines. Most of these examples are from real-life applicants who have given me their permission to incorporate their personal statements into this video for the purpose of their privacy, as well as to strengthen a point. I've taken the liberty of tweaking some words here and there, but the gist remains the same. To start off, why is it important to write a strong personal statement? Well, a strong personal statement allows you to become more than a statistic. Medical schools get thousands upon thousands of applications each year. Every single applicant is interested in science and wants to help others, otherwise they wouldn't want to pursue medicine. The personal statement is your chance to showcase your individual strengths and show them qualities that may not be evident through a transcript or the rest of your application. For example, do you embody compassion? Do you work well in a team? A strong personal statement can result in an interview invite for an applicant with below average stats, whereas a subpar personal statement can result in a rejection even for an applicant with superior stats. Of course, I have read some mediocre personal statements of applicants that have gotten in, but you have to keep in mind that medical schools look at the entirety of an applicant's application. So most of these applicants had phenomenal extracurriculars, research, and test scores. A strong personal statement won't make up for weaker parts of your application, but it can encourage the admissions committee to take a chance on you when they may not have otherwise. Moreover, the personal statement is one of the few things that you still can control right now. If you're about to apply, chances are you can't do much to improve your GPA, MCAT, etc. So you need to capitalize on the things that you can control. In this case, it's writing a strong personal statement that can showcase who you are as a person, as well as why you would embody the qualities necessary to become a good physician. For those of you who have below average stats or overcame difficulties, this is your chance to explain how you learned from those obstacles and subsequently became a better person as well as better student who will succeed in medical school despite former mistakes and struggles. Alright, let's move on to the most important guideline that I recommend. Ironically, it's also the most common mistake that I've seen. The MCAS prompt reads, use the space provided to explain why you want to go to medical school. This is, hands down, the shortcoming I've seen the most of. I've read quite a few essays where the applicant talks about their experience working as a medical assistant, scribe, etc. Their way of answering the prompt is by retelling a patient experience that they said was really fulfilling and inspiring and show them how much they loved patient care. However, that doesn't quite answer the prompt. You can be inspired by a patient as a medical assistant or a scribe, and you can love working with patients, but that explains why you want to go into healthcare. After all, you can continue working with patients and being inspired by them in your current position. If you love helping people and you love making fulfilling connections, you can do that as a social worker or a psychologist. You don't need to explicitly say why you don't want to go into other fields of healthcare, but you do need to be crystal clear in terms of why you specifically want to be a physician. The question you want to address is this: what can you not do right now that a doctor can do? How would going to medical school allow you to benefit others? Alright, I'll start off with the first example now. One involved Lexi, a 19-year-old girl who had taken MDMA, causing her to ramble unintelligibly and be paranoid of anyone who came near her. After one of the emergency physicians treated her, I sat with her to write a report, but she was hesitant in fear of legal repercussions. Since I was one of the few staff close to her age, I had no trouble talking about our similarities. To connect with her, I had to meet her less as an employee and more as her equal. I wanted her to understand that while I wore a uniform and tossed radio codes around, I was just like her in many ways, as a music fanatic and a student who tries to enjoy life too. By the time she was discharged, she was much cheerier and even laughed at her own recklessness. This interaction proved how powerful compassion is in shaping a patient's experience and further cemented my desire to be a physician. This applicant does a good job in terms of showing how he connected with the patient and how that connection made the patient feel more happy and comfortable. This paints him as someone who relates easily to others and is passionate about patient care. However, there isn't a clear reason as to why he wants to pursue becoming a doctor. In his current position, he can continue connecting with patients and shaping their experiences just like he did with Lexi. So why does he need to go to medical school? Okay, moving on to the second example. Ava spent weeks in the hospital, but her playful imagination remained constant throughout. We often sat at the playroom table and created stories with figurines, and when that became boring, we played hide and seek. One day, Ava begged me to take her to the playroom, but I tried to explain that staying in her room would keep her safe and healthy. Not knowing what her diagnosis was or why she was on precautions left me confused and frustrated because she had been stuck in the hospital for so many weeks. Although Ava seemed to enjoy my company, I wanted to offer her more than that. I wanted to understand the complexity of her illness and to use my knowledge to guide her to recovery. This applicant also does a good job in showing how she connected to the patient. However, and more importantly, she discusses how her limited knowledge as a volunteer frustrated her and she wasn't able to help the patient as much as she would have liked, and that is why she wants to go to medical school. Both of these applicants do a great job in terms of explaining how they were able to positively impact a patient's life, as well as how they themselves were inspired from that experience. However, the second applicant does a better job of answering the prompt and explaining why she wants to become a doctor. When you first start shadowing and or taking care of patients, write down any patient encounter that stands out to you or made an impact on you. Write down specific lessons that you learned. Think of those moments that made you think, whoa, that is why I want to become a doctor. Describe what happened, think about how you felt, and recall how the patient and or doctor reacted. By starting early and writing down specific encounters and lessons, you will hopefully have a good variety of anecdotes to draw from, not just for when you're writing your personal statement, but also for medical school interviews, which I'll discuss in a future video and link in the cards above whenever that's ready. By accruing anecdotes early on, when it's time to finally start writing your personal statement, you can hopefully see which experiences are the most powerful and will be more likely to help you tell your story to medical schools. Additionally, because our memories tend to falter over time, you'll be able to draw from specific details because you've written them down at the time that it occurred, as opposed to trying to remember what happened a few months or years later. Admissions committees understand that you're not a journalist or an author. You don't need to be well-versed in nuances of rhetoric or syntax. The goal here is to persuade and to express, and you can do that without needing to delve into the complexities of formal and complicated writing. So the goal here is to think about how you would address the prompt. Without needing to go into specific details, think of a few reasons as to why you want to pursue medicine. Do you love patient care? Do you want to serve underprivileged communities? Do you value having an in-depth knowledge of medicine? Many people will have similar reasons, and that's okay. The important thing is to find reasons that speak to you, regardless of how generic they may be. Once you've done that, you've essentially got the building blocks for your outline. Get out a sheet of paper and write down these big ideas for your personal statement, and congratulations, you've just completed the first step. This tip is for everyone, but especially for anyone that struggles with writer's block or perfectionism. You're not going to write a perfect personal statement the first time you set pen to paper, and that's okay. That's what revisions and edits are for. If writing still seems too daunting, you can even record yourself answering the prompt. For example, you can pretend that you've just met someone and they're asking the usual questions of what's your name, what do you do for work, etc. You say that you're a student and you want to become a doctor. When they ask why, you can hit the record button and start giving your reasons as to why you want to go to medical school. Once you finish recording, you can transcribe your words onto a Word document. Forget all the formal rules and just let the words flow out. The general format of an essay starts off with an intro paragraph, followed by 2 or 3 body paragraphs, and ends with a concluding paragraph. It's up to you how you want to organize the order of your paragraphs. A common one is through chronological order, but you can write from least impactful to most impactful experience, or in some other order. The important thing is to write so that the ideas flow well from one to another. If you do choose to write chronologically, there's no need to write an origin story of what got you initially interested in medicine if that story isn't a compelling one. There's nothing wrong with jumping right into the middle of your journey and writing from there. We won't know the difference. In the intro, you start off with a hook, which is the first sentence that's written to engage the reader. As the name implies, the hook should hook the viewer's attention and make them want to continue reading. Of course, the admissions committee should be reading the entirety of your personal statement regardless of whether they find it interesting or not, but you will stand out more as an applicant if your writing is riveting. A good way to write a compelling hook is to describe a specific scenario rather than jumping into explaining why you want to pursue medicine. Examples of generic hooks are, growing up in a family of physicians, I knew it was my calling to become a doctor. Or, in the past year, I've become better prepared for a career in medicine and have grown in my understanding of what it means to be a physician. Or, after shadowing physicians in multiple specialties, I knew I wanted to join them so that I can also help people who are suffering. These hooks are all generic because anyone can write them, and many people do. They're all valid responses, but they're not specific or powerful ones. Examples of more compelling hooks might be, the room was filled with screens of maps and statistics tracking a rapidly spreading disease. Or, as a kid in India, I was always around people who were older than me, and my favorite person to hang out with was my great-grandfather Banji, who lived to be 105. Or, growing up in East Africa, My first encounter with the consequences of the limited educational systems there was when I first saw my mother administer an incorrect amount of insulin. The examples I just read introduce a personal and or interesting topic, and they narrow the scope of the writing to a specific moment. With the last two examples, you also get a sense of who the applicant is and what he or she valued. For example, it's clear that the second applicant really valued his time with his great-grandfather. He seems like a strong family man. For the third applicant, it's clear that they really value education, as they've seen the consequences of a lack of knowledge. Both of these writers can then easily transition to talking about how these experiences encourage them to want to pursue medicine, because among many things, medicine deals with caring for and educating patients. Moving along, the intro paragraph also generally includes the thesis, which is the main idea of your entire personal statement. Without needing to go into details yet, the reader should have a good idea of why you want to pursue medicine within the first paragraph. The general format for your body paragraph is to start off with a topic sentence, which touches upon the ideas that you'll be discussing later on in the rest of the paragraph. After that, you move on to the middle section, which is the body of the paragraph, or the meat of the paragraph, where you'll be going into specific details. You then end it with a concluding sentence, where you summarize the ideas that you discussed in the previous sections of the paragraph. The conclusion should briefly summarize why you want to go into medicine. A nice way to tie it up would be to connect some part of your conclusion to some previous part of your essay. For example, I've read a personal statement in which the applicant said that she'd been told that she shouldn't pursue medicine unless she was 100% certain that she wanted to go into this field. At that time, she wasn't. She was 99% sure, but there were still some uncertainties and she wasn't quite 100% there. Throughout the rest of her personal statement, she would then go on to talk about the reasons and the experiences that allowed her to become more certain in her decision to pursue medicine, and she concluded her personal statement by saying that she had found her 1%. Another way to tie up your conclusion would be to extend your ideas a little further. For example, if you talk about what you learned while shadowing physicians, in your concluding paragraph, you can talk about how you hope to emulate those same qualities and incorporate those same lessons when treating your own patients in the future. With every new paragraph or idea, you want to make sure that you include a proper transition. For example, some common ones are furthermore, on the other hand, etc. Just something to indicate that you're either further elaborating upon a certain topic or you're moving on to another topic. You can also use chronological transitions, such as once I moved away for college, when I first started working as a CNA, etc. Regardless of what transition you use, the idea here is to connect different topics so that you're not jumping from one to the next and confusing the reader. Furthermore, another way to ensure fluidity is to write in the same tense, so you don't want to go from writing in the present tense to the past tense and jumping back and forth between the two. And of course, once you're done writing, you want to make sure that you go back and get rid of any grammatical errors, as that can undermine the reading experience as well. Just as people are advised not to bring politics into the workplace, you have to be wary of the topics that you choose to discuss in your personal statement. For instance, abortion is a hotly debated topic in healthcare. Regardless of where you stand on it, writing about an abortion case may upset some readers. Another example that I've read about is raving. This student wrote, "Insomniac, a company that organizes global music festivals, immersed me in a colorful culture often maligned for its association with drugs. While this reputation can be cast unfairly, drug use is not unheard of and can produce some unsettling cases." He then went on to write about a patient who had been admitted to the ER after attending a rave. Since I was one of the few staff close to her age, I had no problem talking about our similarities like college, Generation Z culture, and growing up in Southern California, and she warmed up to my presence quickly. Although it's good that this applicant was able to connect to the patient through their similarities and subsequently put her at ease, he could have done so without saying that he'd engaged with a company that's associated with drug use. Popping ecstasy and engaging with other substances is not uncommon at raves, and even if the applicant didn't partake himself, one, it's not clear that he didn't partake, and two, some people that read this may look down upon raving, regardless of the attendant's sobriety. In essence, you want to think about how your personal statement would read from the perspective of a medical admissions committee. Since you don't know who will be reading your personal statement, it's best to err on the side of caution. Yes, there will be admissions committee members that are physicians or other healthcare professionals, but there will also be members who are researchers or other faculty. Don't use medical jargon unless you explain what it means. Along the same lines, unless it's clear that the majority of readers will understand what you're saying, you want to elaborate on any complex ideas, phrases, or words that you use. Not everyone will know what a PA or an MA or a CNA is, so it's best to first write out the full title, so physician assistant, medical assistant, certified nursing assistant, etc. After writing out the full title, you can then add the acronym in parentheses afterwards, and you can subsequently use the acronym throughout the rest of your personal statements. This will ensure that you don't confuse any readers. As the saying goes, actions speak louder than words. For example, chances are you will be more likely to trust someone who you saw return a phone to the lost and found, as opposed to someone who simply says they're a very honest person. Any applicant can say that they're kind and compassionate in their personal statement, but not everyone has experiences showing that they embody these positive qualities. Describe your actions and allow the readers to understand these qualities that you have as opposed to explicitly telling them. Oftentimes, the stronger message lies in between the lines. Furthermore, by being specific and retelling a patient encounter, you're able to add a unique story to your personal statement. Many applicants have research experience and patient care experience, and they can all tell you about the lessons that they learned while working in a lab, a clinic, or a hospital. The problem is that many of these lessons will be the same. They learned about the value of connecting to patients, the importance of teamwork, etc. By telling the reader what you learned or why you're passionate, you risk losing yourself amidst the mass of other applicants who can say the exact same thing. By writing about a specific patient encounter, you are able to describe an experience that is solely unique to you and let the lessons speak for themselves. After all, 1 million people can work as a medical assistant, but each one will have a different experience. The way you write about your experience is how you will set yourself out from the rest of the applicants. And by showing that experience rather than telling, you not only refrain from writing a generic personal statement, but you also write a much more powerful one. Okay, let's read the first example. Via a technical program, I obtained certification as a nursing aide. Through this work as a caregiver to elderly and dependent adults, I saw firsthand the fragility of life and the imperative importance of advocating on behalf of those who cannot do so for themselves. I transitioned into hospice care, a position I found to be profoundly insightful, as I had the ability to fulfill the final wishes of my patients. This example solely tells me what was learned. The applicant says that he learned about the importance of advocating for others and that this experience was really insightful. Well, what insight did he gain? That's not specified, and this paragraph doesn't really tell me much about who he is as a person. Every other person working in hospice care or as a nursing aide has probably dealt with the fragility of life. How did this applicant specifically fulfill his patient's last wishes? How did he advocate for others? He tells me what he has learned, but there aren't enough details for me to form a clear picture of who he is as a person, what insight he gained from this experience, or how he grew from this. Okay, moving on to the second example. Ed walked in and shouted, "Hey, how you doing today?" He had already had all toes removed from his right foot, and his current concern were the ulcers on his left leg. I got uncomfortable as he caught me up on his week. I started cutting away at the layers of bandages and used a gentle foam cleanser to rid his leg of debris. Ed sighed as I scrubbed away, telling me how his leg had been itchy for the past few days. I made sure to clean every one of his open wounds well, doing my best to remove any bacteria or debris that could interfere with his healing process. 2 weeks go by before I see Ed again. As I remove his bandages, he says, "I have a good feeling about this one." Once the bandages come off, I see some of his wounds have almost closed. All of the effort I put into making sure I had sterilized completely and prepared him for further treatment had paid off. This example highlights how this applicant is attentive to detail, as she had taken the time and made the effort to make sure that the patient's wounds were fully cleaned. When Mo caught her up on his week and sighed with relief as the itchiness cleared away, that shows how comfortable he is with her, which can be seen as a rather impressive trait because having your wounds cleaned isn't exactly a painless process. It's evident that she learned about the importance of proper wound management, as well as how consistent and proper care can result in happier and healthier results for the patient. All of these descriptions paint a picture of not only the applicant, but also the applicant's relationship with the patient, as well as what the applicant learned from this process. All of this is done without explicitly telling us this. We as readers are allowed to make our own inferences, and that's what makes this story that much more powerful. Alright, so how do we show rather than tell? Well, I'm glad you asked. One way to show rather than tell is by focusing on objective statements rather than subjective ones. An example of describing subjectively would be, Dr. L took the time to indulge his curiosity. I watched Jay's eyes light up with excitement. Avoid talking about emotions explicitly, like saying something was done with sadness, with excitement, etc. With excitement or with sadness doesn't paint a clear picture because people express emotions in different ways. For example, 3 people could be sad, but one could be frowning, another could be crying, and the last could be silence. There's no clear picture of what with sadness means, so there's no clear story here. Instead, use commonly known actions that are used to describe emotions so that you're able to show these emotions instead of explicitly describing them. For example, the previous example will be more powerful if it were rewritten as, Jay gasped when Mr. L pointed to the aorta, or With wide eyes, Jay nodded as he focused on the anatomical model that Dr. L showed him. Neither gasped nor wide eyes explicitly tell us what Jay was feeling. However, based on the descriptions, we can infer that he was shocked/excited/curious. Another example will be exchanging adverbs. For instance, instead of saying he angrily took back the paper, you can say he ripped the paper out of my hands. Use different verbs to denote positive or negative emotions rather than explicitly saying what you or someone else felt. Another example would be replacing a more simple verb like he said or she said angrily with a stronger one, such as he shouted, he yelled, he cried. Describe the scene so that the reader can get a clear picture of what's going on. One way to do this is to include sensory details. What did the environment look like, smell like, taste like, sound like, feel like? You don't need to include descriptions for all of your senses. However, if you are struggling in terms of how to describe a certain scenario, answering these questions can be a way of doing so. However, and this is very important, you only want to elaborate upon relevant descriptions. For example, I read a personal statement where the applicant told me that the administrative building she was walking towards smelled like perfume, and she gave me the color of the walls. Were these details relevant? Not quite. The focus of her story was the patient that she had passed along the way to the administrative building. She had given me details about her destination, but the focus of her story was on the journey. So in this case, the details that she gave me were not relevant to her story. In someone else's case, a similar description might be relevant. For example, if someone were to indicate that the paint on the walls of the clinic was chipping away, or that there were vines climbing up along the fence, then that depicts this building as a more decrepit one. We now have a better understanding that she may not be in a well-maintained area and that these patients may live in underprivileged communities. There's an underlying message in that scenario, but just writing about the color of the wall or whether someone smelled nice without relating it back to the story you're trying to tell doesn't strengthen any points. And when every word counts, you want to make sure that you're either using your words to answer the prompt or to strengthen your story. Otherwise, you want to revise it. The exception to this rule is when you're describing your thoughts on something. You want to rely on showing rather than telling when describing a scenario that involves other people because their thoughts and actions are better able to be elucidated. However, it's hard to show an experience that ignited your interest in primary care, the importance of nutrition, etc. So in this case, it's alright to tell, but the goal is to show whenever possible. Many of the personal statements that I've read are riddled with run-on sentences. I understand that many of you have ideas that you want to elaborate upon, but you can do that by using appropriate semicolons and commas and dividing longer sentences into shorter, more concise ones. This is especially true whenever you're describing a patient experience or a scenario that's filled with action. For example, she stopped breathing is a lot more impactful and relates more to the stop and go and disjointed thinking that you yourself would go through in an urgent scenario as opposed to, I watched frantically as she struggled to breathe, and I wondered what she must be feeling and how her parents are crying in the lobby and did her light flash before her eyes like they say in the movies. Taking care of patients is a major component of medicine, but it's not the only component. If you've already discussed clinical experience in one paragraph, you can use the rest of your paragraphs to talk about research, about volunteer, about other experiences, so long as they relate back to the prompt. They give you the opportunity to display other facets of your personality, as well as discuss other reasons that you want to pursue medicine, and you can also incorporate more interesting and multifaceted components into your personal statements. I often read essays where the author talks about their job duties or that they learned about the different parts of the heart in their anatomy class. Don't tell me about anything else that can be found in your resume, in your activity section, or other parts of your medical school application. Each individual section of your application is an opportunity to showcase a different side of you. Don't waste that opportunity by reiterating the same information that can be found elsewhere. By doing that, you also bore the reader. A common example I see of why someone wants to go into healthcare is that they were a patient themselves, or they knew someone who was a patient and the doctor didn't treat them well. So then they're like, I want to go into medicine because I was upset about my lack of proper care, and I want to become a doctor so that I can make sure that everyone is treated well. By writing this as your reason, you have just implicitly revealed yourself to be petty and resentful. No one wants a doctor who chose to go into this profession so that they can show they were better than others. Now, is it possible that you or someone you knew actually were mistreated by a physician, and that is what inspired you to want to become a doctor? Yes, that's entirely possible. However, and this might be hard for you to think of, there must have been some positive quality that physician possessed. For example, maybe you thought they were really impatient and had a short temper, but you were impressed with their diagnosis or how they were able to explain your treatment plans to you. Focus on what they did well and how that made a difference in your life and set you on the path to recovery. Concentrate on what was done properly and what positive emotions the doctor's actions were able to elicit, and use those reasons as why you want to become a doctor yourself who can do the same for your future patients. Another common example I see is that, unlike their pre-med peers, this applicant did not know what they wanted to do for the majority of their life, or that they're not as smart but they work hard, or that their parents pressured them into it but they eventually grew to become passionate about the field itself. Here's an example of that. I never wanted to become a doctor. When my parents uprooted our family 17 years ago and immigrated to the United States, the choice was made for me. Our family spent our first few immigrant years in poverty. Each night, my parents would tuck me into bed and they'd tell me to study hard so I could one day pay them back for all of their hardships. Again, pay them back and financial security were both synonymous with becoming a doctor. Even if it wasn't my dream, I felt it was my duty as their child to become a doctor so they could live comfortably for the remainder of their lives. Unfortunately, filial piety can only fuel one's motivation for so long before it turns resentment. In my case, my motivation dissipated during my senior year of high school. I became resentful of the fact that I was always studying hard when a majority of my classmates were not. The prompt asks why you want to become a doctor, not why you didn't want to become a doctor and then subsequently change your mind. I can understand that it's not uncommon for parents to pressure their kids into pursuing the medical profession. And it's admirable that this applicant appreciates the life that his parents were able to provide for him and wants to give back. However, focusing on this reason and giving admissions the idea that you don't actually care about patients and you just want to enter this profession because you want to pay back your family paints you in a negative light. Remember, you want the reader to like you and think that you will become a good doctor. Be honest about your mistakes and shortcomings, but don't focus on your negative traits. Expanding upon the notion of not speaking negatively of yourself, you want to lead with positive phrases. For example, you would lead with a negative phrase by saying, "I was sad, but my resolve strengthened over time." Instead, you can say, "My resolve strengthened to replace my distress." It's a slight difference, but it shines a better light on you by highlighting the more positive elements first. Take any chance you can to emphasize your positive qualities and encourage the reader to see you as someone they would want to accept to their school. Don't write about patients as if you're above them. As a healthcare professional, you have the opportunity to help those in need, but that doesn't make you superior in any way. One example I came across was this. One patient I had was Kate, a 32-year-old woman with cerebral palsy who sought relief for her most prominent symptom, body-wide spasticity. As a student with little exposure to working in healthcare at the time, I initially bought into the reputation of people with disabilities being difficult to handle, and I was not sure if I could handle her tantrums and bickering. As I spent more time with her, however, something that I was unsure about became an activity I cherished as I walked her through her exercises. She proved that her disorder, despite being incurable, was in no way too severe a handicap to a quality life. Even if the applicant later changed his mind about people with disabilities, speaking negatively about his initial thoughts paints him as someone who lacks compassion. Medical schools want to accept people who are empathetic, and empathetic people would think about how difficult that patient's life may be, not how difficult that patient may be to handle. Additionally, his last sentence, "She proved that her disorder, despite being incurable, was in no way too severe a handicap to a quality life." This sentence implies that the applicant thinks that incurable disorders are a severe handicap to quality life. There are many people with different mental and/or physical abilities that lead a great life. It may be a different life and they may have to face different challenges, but it's not fair to push quote-unquote normal standards on them and think that their life is inferior just because it's different. Every single person has gone through some obstacles in life. Some of these obstacles may have caused your GPA to fall, or prevented you from getting lots of extracurricular experience. Whatever negative experience you had, write about it in a sentence or two. Don't make it a sob story. Everyone has failed or struggled sometime in their life. You expanding upon a terrible experience doesn't set you apart from any other applicant. Instead, write about what you learned from that experience and what actions you took as a result of learning from that lesson. For instance, in my second year of college, a close friend took his own life. That quarter, my GPA was a 2.36. This is how I chose to write about it in my personal statement. My GPA reached its lowest point when a close friend died by suicide at the end of my second year. That experience emphasized the importance of overall well-being, especially in regards to not only the physical, but also the mental and social aspects. This perspective is one that draws me to primary care. And then I started writing about why I like primary care. I clearly stated what I had learned and I only talked about the tragedy itself in one sentence. If it isn't related to why you want to pursue medicine, then don't elaborate on any hardships. The prompt asks why you want to pursue medicine, and you should be using every part of your personal statement to address it. If, however, the hardship is related to why you want to pursue medicine, then you can write more about it. For example, I've read quite a few personal statements where the applicant grew up with financial difficulties or they lived in underprivileged communities, and because of that, they were able to get a better understanding of how healthcare tends to be of poor quality in those communities, and that subsequently motivated them to want to pursue medicine so that they can go back and provide quality care for the community. You still want to be rather short and concise when describing your own struggle so that it doesn't become a sob story, but you can elaborate upon your experiences and what you learned and how that made you a more empathetic person or inspired you to become a doctor. At one of my medical school interviews, I actually did discuss my friend's suicide for a bit. I wasn't expecting to, and I can't quite remember the specific context or the question that was asked, but it did catch me off guard. However, looking back, I realized that it should not have. Anything that you include in your personal statement or any other part of your application is fair game. After all, if the admissions committee member took the time to fully look over your application, then it's only fair that they can ask you to elaborate upon any part of that application. So if any experience will bring about too many negative emotions for you to discuss and keep your composure during an interview, then don't bring it up in your personal statement or any other part of your application. Everyone has enough life experience to write more than the word limit and still be concise. With every sentence that you write, ask yourself, does this answer the prompt? Or is it at least relevant to the prompt? Does this strengthen my story? If the answer to either of those questions is no, then you're going to want to either delete or rewrite that sentence or paragraph. For example, don't write, in my opinion, I think. You're essentially using different words to say the same thing, and as a result, you're not being resourceful with your word count. On that note, don't even include phrases like, in my opinion, or I think. Instead of saying, I think it's important that all patients are taken care of, you can say, it's important that all patients are taken care of. Something being important is obviously a matter of opinion rather than fact, so it's implied that it's your opinion, and there's no need for you to explicitly say it. You can use different words to say similar things, but even words that are synonyms can be different in terms of the tone that they set. For example, I crashed into his car implies a more severe accident than I hit his car or I bumped into his car. Even though they all tell the reader that one car drove into another, each word implies a different tone. Admissions committees can tell when you've essentially puked up thesaurus.com all over your personal statement. Don't use more complex terms when simpler terms will do. It's not your expansive vocabulary that will impress them, but rather how you choose to write. For privacy reasons, you may want to change a patient's name. However, you do not want to say patient X. People connect with names. When you call someone by their name, you are essentially saying, hey, out of everyone in this entire room, I am able to identify you with a name that you've had your entire life, not by calling you some guy or some girl. Similarly, you don't want to say the patient or patient X because that takes away any personal connection that the reader may be able to establish with them. And remember, humans at the end of the day are emotional creatures. A reader is more likely to remember a personal statement that resonated on a personal level with them. Furthermore, going back to being concise, you can just write quotations around the patient's name to indicate that that's not their real name. For example, instead of saying the patient, who we'll call Annie, you can simply write Annie in quotations the first time so that you indicate that that's not the real name. There's nothing wrong with creativity. When done right, it can make a personal statement much more interesting. However, you want to avoid creativity for the sake of creativity. Remember that regardless of what you write or how you choose to write about it, your words should always relate back to the prompt and tell the reader why you want to go to medical school. For example, I read a personal statement in which the applicant spent the majority of her intro paragraph talking about her love for animals. At the very end, she finally talked about her passion for medicine, and she said that it was her love for others, be they animal or human, that encouraged her to want to become a physician. The relationship between her love for others and her love for medicine isn't quite clear, and I'm left to wonder why she doesn't choose to pursue veterinary school instead. If you are going to try to relate medicine to one of your interests or hobbies, the connection should be strong and consistent throughout your personal statements. Here's a good example. By melting butter in a saucepan and adding an equal amount of flour, I have a roux. Adding shredded cheese, milk, or broth yields a mornay, bechamel, or gravy, respectively. Within 2 minutes, I have the base for a seemingly endless variety of sauces. My fascination with roux and my love for cooking are simple. Cooking involves working with your hands, learning new techniques and recipes, and tailoring dishes to your guests' tastes. Much like cooking, medicine requires critical thinking and research to derive treatments for diverse patients. Medicine also requires compassion and an understanding that certain groups especially need attention. For the same reasons I have pursued cooking and now pursue medicine. The applicant then goes on to discuss how he became drawn to medicine and how he associated that with cooking because he would have to prepare meals for his brother while his parents were at the hospital. He also makes this connection through more concrete analogies, such as, my desire to become a physician started like my desire to explore recipes. I was hungry. Or, I noticed similarities between how I adjusted recipes and how the oncologist adjusted medication based on my grandmother's physical and psychological responses. Yes, he talked about cooking, and at first glance, most people wouldn't think that's related to medicine. However, through the various connections that he was able to make throughout the essay, the reader can see how his two passions are linked. You can be creative, but just make sure that you're cohesive and that, as always, you're addressing the prompt. Don't write about an example or a patient encounter and assume that the lesson or what you gain from that experience is evident to the reader. For example, one applicant wrote, I document relevant parts of a patient's history and help physicians think critically about treatment. In doing so, I help alleviate the anxiety of the unknown and ease suffering. I know firsthand how it feels to have that apprehension lifted off one's shoulders like a weight. He says that he alleviates the anxiety of the unknown and eases suffering. Not only is that quite a bold claim, but it's also an unclear one. Whose anxiety is he relieving? The patient's or the physician's? How does documenting a patient's history help to ease suffering? Maybe he was thinking that he was easing suffering because he alleviated the physician's workload by scribing, and therefore he eased suffering because he made the physician's job easier? I'm not quite sure, it's not clear. It's important that you explain the lessons you learned or the impact that you made, especially if you're going to make bold claims for either of those components. Small interactions with other people can make a really big impact on their lives. However, this is rare. Thinking on your own life and the day-to-day interactions that you have, chances are that not many of them stand out to you. And that's just how the nature of our brain works. If everything was important, then nothing would be important because that would take too much cognitive effort to compute. So don't write about your interactions as if you completely changed a patient's life. For example, one applicant wrote, this patient had already been coming in for months with little improvement. I noticed that she seemed like she had given up and was curious to see what the doctor's next step would be. I lifted Jan with words of encouragement. After my emotional intervention, she slowly began to progress. You want to avoid this type of hero language. It implies that you think you were the sole reason that these patients got better, and it sounds naive. After all, if kind words were all that were needed for a patient to get better, there would be no need for medicine. Also, in this example, that doesn't really sound realistic. A patient who had been coming in for months and wasn't getting better suddenly starts making progress because some kind words were said to her. That doesn't really make sense. Okay, now I will read a more realistic example. I learned the importance of pausing before I spoke, so the patients understood that their voices were heard and that I was actively listening. I saw that people began to trust me and open up about other aspects that impact their health, such as domestic violence and mental health issues, allowing me to better direct them to specific resources that apply to their individual needs. Although there were barriers and I wasn't able to completely help each individual, I am eager to learn how to better address biological, psychological, and sociological components of health. Oftentimes, there are struggles that patients go through that doctors and other healthcare professionals may not be able to help with. For example, a patient may be homeless, or they may have trouble getting enough food on the table. This applicant does a great job of illustrating what he did to help and what sort of connection he was able to make with the patients, but he was also realistic and understood his limitations. He recognized the scope of both his responsibilities as well as his impact, and depicted this limited scope as a reason for why he wants to pursue medicine, which relates back to the prompt. As for advice and feedback from friends, family, etc., it may also not be a bad idea to ask for input from an acquaintance that you don't know very well, as they'll be able to give a less biased perspective. Furthermore, if you know someone in the healthcare field or know someone who majors in English or writing, then it might not be a bad idea to ask for their advice as well, because they'll have some expertise on the subject. You want to be receptive to their criticism and always express your gratitude because they've taken the time to read your personal statement and give you feedback. However, you do want to be aware of the value and the source of the criticism. Just because a suggestion is made doesn't mean it's a good idea to implement that suggestion in your revisions, and you always want to take recommendations with a grain of salt. And I do mean everything. Check for grammar, check for organization, check for fluidity, etc. Does each sentence make sense? Does each sentence have a purpose? And of course, going back to the most important question of all, does each sentence relate back to the prompt? When you spend enough time with another person, you don't really get a sense of how they've changed over time. However, if you visit a relative that you haven't seen in a while, they're like, oh my, you've gotten fat. Along the same lines, when you take some time away from your personal statement, once you revisit it, you're able to get a more fresh perspective and you can get a better idea of what it is that you need to change to improve your essay. Medical schools want to admit students that they think will become good physicians. What positive qualities can you contribute not only to the medical school, but also to the medical field as a whole? What lessons can you teach? What ideas and qualities do you want to see more of in the field of healthcare? For example, in my personal statement, I wrote about the qualities that I had as a volunteer, which will hopefully translate to my future as a physician. I wrote, I saw patients with musculoskeletal issues that stem from their blue-collar jobs, and multiple cases of diabetes and hypertension that had culminated from years of high carbohydrate diets. Although there are genetic factors involved, diabetes and hypertension are strongly linked to diet. Primary care values the power of prevention through annual office visits, when potential problems can be assessed for before they have the chance to escalate. Proper nutrition can not only play a restorative role, but can be crucial in preventing various illnesses. Through these sentences, I expressed how I would strive to emphasize preventative care in medicine. Of course, writing about what you can offer is not necessary, because although it can strengthen your personal statement, it does not address the prompt. So only write about what you can offer if you have space to. As always, the number one goal is to address the prompt and explain why you want to pursue medicine. Alright, those are my tips for writing a strong personal statement. Remember, your personal statement is your chance to highlight your individual strengths, as well as tell a personal story as to why you want to pursue medicine. Do not give them reason to doubt your desire or your ability to become a good physician. Best of luck, and I'll see you next Sunday. Until then, I surely hope that you'll take care of your health. Psst. If you could hit the like button or subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated, because as you can tell from the lighting, I spent the whole day recording this, and yeah, please hit like and or subscribe.